Welcome to News from Neptune for January 25th in the fourth week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by the right name, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says, terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society is one form or another of state capitalism today. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China, notably. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a wrong question edition of News from Neptune. The Morning News describes a pre-dawn SWAT team arrest of Roger Stone with CNN cameras present. The political establishment and Mueller probe is desperate. Roger Stone, Jr., a longtime Trump advisor, has been charged as part of the investigation by the special counsel, Robert Mueller. The account in the New York Times this morning by Mark Mazzetti and others, their regular correspondents for the Russiagate nonsense, goes on to say something about Stone. I quote, a longtime informal advisor to President Trump, he was charged as part of the special counsel investigation over his communication with WikiLeaks. It had nothing to do with Russian collusion, but it had a great deal to do with the U.S. government's enemies, notably WikiLeaks. The organization, the New York Times says, behind the release of thousands of stolen Democratic emails during the 2016 campaign. That's a flat lie. It's very clear that those emails, stolen or not, were leaked, not hacked, and the leaker was probably Seth Rich, who was killed by someone associated pretty clearly with the American government. Mr. Stone was charged with 7 counts, including obstruction of an official proceeding. Guess which official proceeding? Making false statements and witness tampering, talking to other witnesses, according to the special counsel's office. The indictment is the first in months by the special counsel, Robert S. Mueller III, who is investigating, I'm reading from the New York Times now, hence the archness, who is investigating Russia's interference in the 2016 election, taken as fact, and possible coordination with Trump campaign associates, QED. Citing details in emails and other forms of communications, the indictment suggests Mr. Trump's campaign knew about additional stolen emails before they were released and asked Mr. Stone to find out about them. Mr. Stone, a self-described dirty trickster, began his career as a campaign aide for Richard M. Nixon and has a tattoo of Nixon on his back. You can't make this stuff up. Jeffrey Sinclair remarks, this will be the first time Nixon sees the inside of a jail cell. He spent decades, that is Stone, plying the political dark arts. This is a news report by the New York Times, including scandal mongering, to help influence American election campaigns, and has long maintained that he had no connection to Russia's attempts to disrupt the 2016 presidential election. Russia's attempts, of course, once again taken as fact, when there has been, in fact, no evidence of that. He, Stone, sometimes seemed to taunt American law enforcement agency. How dare he? Daring them to find hard evidence to link him to the Russian election interference. According to the indictment, between June and July of 2016, Mr. Stone, quote, told senior Trump campaign officials about the stolen emails in WikiLeaks possession that could be damaging to Mrs. Clinton. That's certainly something the FBI has got to stamp out, right? On July 22nd, WikiLeaks released its first batch of Democratic emails. No connection of what those emails actually said, which was a real attempt to corrupt a presidential campaign. After that, according to the indictment, the Trump campaign sought more. How dare they? And this is from this indictment delivered at gunpoint by the FBI this morning. Quote, a senior Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone about any additional releases and what other damaging information Organization 1, that's Mueller's way of referring to WikiLeaks, yeah.
Careful, Carl.
You can't make this funnier than it actually is, except for the fact that people are getting hurt. Let me try that again. This is from the indictment delivered at gunpoint to an old guy in Florida this morning. A senior Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone about any additional releases and what other damaging information WikiLeaks had regarding the Clinton campaign, the indictment said, referring to WikiLeaks. You do remember the First Amendment, don't you? The indictment did not make clear who the senior Trump campaign official was and who directed the senior campaign official to reach out to Mr. Stone, although it left open the possibility that it was Mr. Trump, close quote. I mean, in the bad old days of the Soviet Union, the KGB couldn't have set up anything better than this. There's a lot more to be said about this, but I've begun perhaps too early. You're listening to News from Neptune. Here's David Green.
Yeah, I am here. Well, let's continue the New York Times bashing this morning.
Couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of guys.
I've got a pretty New York Times heavy list here.
Okay.
And that was always what Chomsky did. I mean, he introduced media criticism of the liberal media, not the conservative media. Mm-hmm. He thought it was much too easy to pick on William F. Buckley or someone like that. And
as he did himself.
As he did, but still. He wanted people to understand that what people thought of as the liberal media was the media that supports the projection of American power around the world in coercive and often violent ways. So you could approach this from the New York Times perspective from any number of angles in terms of the actual reporting on. I'm referring to Venezuela here, but let's just start with the article today. The sort of how to think about this article by the usual suspects, Peter Baker and Edward Wong. I don't know who Edward Wong is, but Peter Baker is the guy who, as I've said, is going to be the next Thomas Friedman. Intervening against Venezuela's strongman, Trump belies America first. In other words, we got to figure out here how this guy who's doing all these things we don't like by making friends with strongmen around the world is all of a sudden not liking this one strong man who is called a strong man and who the New York Times agrees is a strong man, even though Maduro is the elected leader of Venezuela. So the first paragraph, just to capture the tone of this, the first paragraph is, President Trump has finally met a strong man he does not like. After making friends with autocrats around the world, Mr. Trump has drawn a red line with Nicolas Maduro, demanding that the iron-fisted, I love that, president of Venezuela hand power to his opposition. And then later on he quotes the fellow Michael Shifter, who is head of something called the Inter-American Dialogue, who had written an article the previous day, or maybe the same day, on the op-ed page about Venezuela, a kind of think piece about that. And he's quoted by Peter Baker. Mr. Shifter has said that the president's involvement was welcome, and then Shifter says, if you look at it in a wider context, it's hard to say that this shows a broader commitment to human rights and democracy, he said. But from my perspective, we'll take what we can get. In my view, in other words, it's assuming that the overthrowing the democratically elected government in Venezuela will actually bring democracy to Venezuela. But from my perspective, we'll take what we can get. In my view, he's on the right side of this one, meaning Trump. Whether he's got a strategy, whether it's all been thought out, I don't know. So that's what you've got to say if you basically oppose Trump, but happen to agree with him on this one issue. But let's make this very clear. Who is Michael Shifter, and who are the funders for this inter-American dialogue? You go to Wikipedia, and you find out the dialogue sources of funding come almost exclusively from northern corporations, governments, foundations, and northern-dominated international financial institutions primarily associated with the U.S., not Latin American corporate wealth. Among the corporate-backed foundations are the General Electric Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the John S. This reads like Masterpiece Theater here. The Ford Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Anna E. Casey Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Two corporate funders of the dialogue benefited greatly under neoliberalism. Merck and Company is a pharmaceutical giant that has a natural interest in the ongoing privatization of local health systems, while top 10 holdings of the American International Group, the famous AIG, 4 of which emerged from the privatization of state assets, are engaged in resource extraction, banking and finance, and telecommunications. Among the contributors of the dialogue's funding are companies involved in fossil energy, Chevron, Sempra International, ExxonMobil, BT, Shell, Statoil, mining, Rio Tinto, military equipment, Boeing, Raytheon, and information technology, Apple, Google, Oracle, television, Televisa, publishing, Pearson, etc. The dialogue, this inter-American dialogue, represented by Michael Shifter, who is given the voice to talk about Venezuela, has been a strong advocate of free trade agreements, negotiated with the United States, and has received donations from countries like Colombia, which spent several years advocating passage of its own trade deal with Congress. Other government funding from Latin nations comes from embassies of Chile and Mexico. So you see here that all these international corporate forces are lined up to fund this think tank, which rationalizes the overthrow of the Venezuelan government, whatever its shortcomings, and that is sort of foregrounded in the New York Times.
We have to remember, of course, that when words like democracy are used by the New York Times, it has a fairly specific meaning. It means rule by North American corporations.
Yeah.
The threat to democracy in Venezuela is real. They're talking about a popular uprising led by someone, Bernie Sanders, of all people, called a dead communist dictator. That is Hugo Chavez, and the attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela, like the Obama administration's successful attempt to overthrow the government of Ukraine, is bound up with the notion that democracy can't mean rule by the people, but must mean rule by American corporations.
Yeah,
there's nothing new here.
There was an article in the New York Times about Venezuela, which I think was allowing comments. I could be wrong about this. I think they were allowing comments at first, and then I was interested to read how many people were how many people were not on board with what
Right.
the New York Times was saying and talking about sanctions that weren't mentioned in any of the articles or in this particular article. And then I looked back, and all of a sudden the comments were gone. And I don't know if I'm recalling it correctly or
Well, I
not.
think, yeah.
Whether they might have just decided there's too much dissidence in this
Exactly.
comment section. Let me just quote two things that Jeffrey St. Clair said
friend
this
at
morning on
Counterpunch.
Counterpunch. One sort of one a +1 and one perhaps a -1. See what you think about this, Carl.
Okay.
He said his pithy comment about Sanders was, "How long will the Sandernistas, you know who you are, tolerate Bernie's silence on Venezuela?"
Right.
Question. The other comment is, it's going to be interesting to see how the MAGA left, meaning the apologists for Trump, like us, I guess, Carl.
I wouldn't go that far.
It's okay. Spins how the MAGA left spins a U.S.-sponsored coup in Venezuela. Who will they blame for "quote unquote" tricking Trump into taking an action that he has been jabbering about taking for 4 years now?
The first comment, I think, is more important than the second. The first comment about Bernie Sanders should be substituted or should be supplemented by the reference to the fact that Sanders has now, in fact, issued a statement saying the U.S. should not be involved in sponsoring coups elsewhere. Thanks, Bernie. I mean, that's a good point. You're right about that.
Yep.
But it doesn't tell us a lot about how you read what's going on in Venezuela. Now, I admit the situation in Venezuela is difficult to penetrate, in part because the only accounts we get are from interested sides. But the notion that the U.S. Is providing any sort of pellucid account of the situation is, as usual, not true. Another comment about...
Any comment about the MAGA left? I mean, Jeffrey's being pretty snide here.
Yes, he is. That's true. The MAGA left is a cute term. I was writing something this morning about that, about how much the American political establishment wants to take that phrase, "Make America Great Again," and turn it in a racist direction, try to assumes without proper substantiation that is somehow a racist statement. Now, it seems to me that what many Americans who voted for Donald Trump heard when they heard "Make America Great Again" was a reference to the real conditions of their lives, which over the last 40 years have seen a confiscation of both the lifestyle and the life prospects of the majority of Americans. It's not about race, it's about economics. Make America Great Again means put America back in the situation it was in my parents' time, when there were good jobs at good salaries available, and those good jobs and good salaries have been confiscated by 40 years of neoliberalism. That's the story that's not being told, and that's the real source of the populist vote that made Trump president. I can't get too sympathetic to the notion of the MAGA left as being simply a racist, reactionary account. It's rather an attempt to try to understand that the political establishment is working very hard to make a villain out of Trump. He's giving them a lot of help, of course. Make a villain out of Trump in order not to talk about the real effects of the neoliberal and neoconservative policies that the American political establishment has been promoting through the last several presidential administrations. That's what we should be talking about, and Counterpunch frequently does. So it seems to me it's worthwhile to sort these things out.
Yeah, but just so as we're not beating up all the time or called unfair, it would be important to note that this week the New York Times did carry an op-ed piece by two of the three economists that we refer to often on this program, Emmanuel Says and Gabriel Zuckman, who are Thomas Piketty's colleagues in Berkeley, they published an article called "Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's tax hike idea is not about soaking the rich. It's about curtailing inequality and saving democracy." So you can read that. If you listen to this program, you won't learn a whole lot from it, but they're willing to go that far for whatever, so they can say that they're being liberal and considering ideas and all that kind of good stuff, right? While they don't ever mention sanctions on Venezuela and what the effect is of that.
This is an important line and an important discussion, and since it's an important discussion, the American political establishment is doing what it can to obfuscate it. Alexandria or
AOC, as she's called.
AOC actually is probably not bad. Has made these comments about taxes. This comment about taxes that has indeed offered some raw meat to the Democratic establishment by saying, oh yes, we don't want to raise taxes on those wealth producers that are out there running the American economy. There is a problem with her suggestion to put tax rates back at that income tax rates back at the level she wants would not be a bad idea in terms of financing the American government, but it does make one mistake, and the mistake is to tax income rather than wealth. As Piketty and his friends, whom you were quoting, would say right away, the point is to tax wealth, not income. What's happened is that wealth has concentrated remarkably in this country over the last generation. Not only has it concentrated, I mean, fewer and fewer people controlling more and more wealth, but it's done it at an accelerated rate. That is, it gets faster and faster that it concentrates. This is the situation that Alexandria Cortez, why can't I get her name right?
I don't know.
That Alex is referring to, and Alexandria, and
Ocasio-Cortez.
But the point is that task is to tax wealth, not income. And guess who has said that this week? Elizabeth Warren, another of the papabili, people who want to, that's an old word being for someone who wants to be pope. Papabili, I mean here, people who want to be president. Okay. There are a lot of them running around these days, and amongst the Democrats. And Warren, who has a lot of baggage of her own on these issues, certainly understands that the task is to tax wealth, not income. And she's probably one of the few who said it. Certainly one few of the papabili who said it.
Yeah, and another person who's running for president, Kamala Harris, the senator from California, who I had my eye on. Norman Fink, pardon?
The cop, as Jeffrey calls her.
Yes, all right. And I had my eye on her even before Jeffrey made this comment this morning, which I will read. But Norman Finkelstein had put up her speech to AIPAC that she gave 2017, so nearly 2 years ago, just showing that Kamala Harris
Good.
is just we're
having trouble with these names,
name challenged today, is someone that seriously I could never ever vote for. And not only could I not ever vote for her, I can't even watch a 20-minute speech before AIPAC, except maybe 1 minute at a time over 20 days. Just awful, just absolutely awful.
Yep.
And one of the quotes from it that Jeffrey St. Clair happened to have from it, which sort of summarizes what she said, what this woman is willing to say before AIPAC. I believe Israel should never be a partisan issue. And as long as I'm a United States Senator, I will do everything in my power to ensure broad and bipartisan support for Israel's security and right to self-defense. This woman, that woman, Kamala Harris, is just a piece of work. And she's an identity politics piece of work, and she foregrounds it. She says, I've got a South Asian mother and a black Jamaican father, and I'm married to a Jewish husband, and I had a Jewish wedding. We broke the glass, and or he broke the glass. So it's like she's just shameless, and I just have to say, I'm just venting here, from watching this speech at APAC from a couple years ago, her speaking style and her charismatic or lack of charismatic qualities, I don't think is going to cut it. She is not a charismatic figure. Not to play that game. I don't mean to play that game. I'm just saying she's. Even though who is it? Dave Leonard at the New York Times wants her candidacy to be taken very seriously. I don't think the voters are going to take it very seriously. But not that there's anyone all that much better out there, unless I would have to say if Bernie Sanders, with all his issues, actually gets into the race. And in spite of Elizabeth Warren's comment that you just referred to, Elizabeth Warren is nothing but a neoliberal in a dressed up sort of way.
What a surprise. You're watching news from Neptune. The U.S. political establishment very much wants you to oppose Trump's administration for fear that he might interfere with the military and economic policy of recent administrations, Obama's and Bush's and others, as Trump, has threatened to do since the presidential campaign. It would be far better to work against those policies, hence against the duopoly, which promise more war and more inequality. The policies do. By the duopoly here, I mean the Republicans and Democrats, the administrators of the political state for the American 1%. In his remarkable 1973 novel, all that time ago and still quite remarkable, Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon offers this as one among his proverbs for paranoids. Quote, "If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers." Close quote. How can we reverse the 2016 election is a wrong question. Better questions than the purposeful distraction of how do we get Trump out are A, how do we reverse the murderous foreign policy, neoconservatism, of the United States, and B, how do we reverse the criminal economic policy, neoliberalism, of the United States? Most people should oppose the duopoly, the administrative rule by the Republicans and Democrats, because it does not serve the interests of the majority at home or abroad, but it serves rather the opposed interests of the American elite, the 1%, or more accurately, the less than 1%. The American ruling class must ensure that dismay among the majority, dismay at the U.S. multiple wars around the world and increasing and accelerating inequality at home, can be contained. That's what they're worried about, and that's what they're calling upon their administrators, the duopoly, Republicans and Democrats, to do, but obviously they can't do that too openly. The present scheme is to divert the dismay that produced Trump, to Trump himself, but their desperation is shown by the fantastical nature of the diversion, Russiagate, for which they've enlisted the aid of the elite-dominated mainstream media to an extent that I would not have thought possible. And look, I'm old enough to have cut my political teeth on McCarthyism. That's what I grew up reading the newspaper about and so forth. And even with that as a background, I would never have expected the phantasmagoria of Russiagate to have been generated by the mainstream political establishment. It suggests, A, how seriously they take the populist upsurge, and B, how desperate they are to find anything to counter it. What's happening is that many Americans are seeing their standard of living and their life chances being confiscated by 40 years of neoliberal policies. After increasing throughout the previous 30 years, the so-called Piketty, whom we mentioned a moment ago, refers to the 30 glorious years, 1945 to 1975, when America and Europe rebuilt the economy after the Second World War. America, of course, being the country that was far less damaged than any other major country by that war. Since that period, since the end of the 30 glorious years of rebuilding in the 1970s, wages in the U.S. have been flat. Wages from the end of the Second World War, taking off wartime controls, up to the mid-'70s, wages in America increased along line with the increasing productivity of American industry. But in the 1970s, those curves diverged. Wages remained flat, and the productivity continued upwards, enriching the 1%, or a fraction of the 1%. For many people, making America great again means restoring the opportunities for jobs and income that my parents had and that I don't. That's not an accident, but the result of conscious choices of every American administration, beginning with Jimmy Carter's. It's the basis for the populist upsurge that produced Sanders and Trump. The populist vision has been described as a view that, quote, pits a virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others, quotes for others, who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice, close quote. The growth of this view is not limited to the U.S. It's also produced Brexit in Britain, the Yellow Vests in France, the new Italian government, remarkably enough, and similar events across the capitalist world. The elites recognize it and fear it, and move heaven and earth through their control of the media to convince the bien-pensants that it's all a matter of racism. It's not. That was actually a response to a note someone sent me on Facebook. So.
Yeah, very good, very good.
You've heard it before from me.
Yeah, there was a nice, well, I'm thinking of it, I noticed an article on the Jacobin blog by a guy named Matt Brunig, who's a good, a good economic analyst.
His wife's interesting too.
And his wife, and they do a podcast which is kind of droll, and you know, and right-headed, but he wrote an article which was a defense of Alexandria, of AOC's Ocasio-Cortez's points that she made, which had been critiqued by Glenn Kessler, who is the fact checker or the truth teller of the Washington Post. So if you want to check out what's going on with that back and forth, you can do that at the Jacobin website. Another little, while I'm referencing things here, a guy that I've had my eye on, who's a student of Leo Panitch, Stephen Maher, M-A-H-E-R, has been doing, who's a grad student, as a lot of these people are, who's one of the research interests is the history of the corporation, aforementioned corporation, General Electric. And he did a nice interview with Doug Henwood on Doug Henwood's radio program that, of course, can be listened to. Just 25 minutes, very, very concise, very dense, very well done, about the nature of GE. Let me just read this part of it, just to sort of add to what we're saying here about neoliberalism. Jeff Immelt's resignation, this goes back to an article he wrote in 2017, that's also on the Jacobin website. Jeff Immelt's resignation as CEO of General Electric shows that we cannot think of industry as finance's opponent. The resignation of Jeff Immelt's resignation last month, this is in 2017, is the latest sign of the broad restructuring of political and economic power currently underway in the United States. His departure and John Flannery's arrival reveals a lot about the new phase of financialization that has emerged from the great financial crisis, that of 2008. As financial markets and institutions become a more important part of the economy in recent decades, so did they take on a larger role within corporations themselves, even ostensibly non-financial enterprises. This fundamental reorganization of corporate power eroded the institutional foundations of the New Deal's so-called corporate liberalism, contributed to growing state authoritarianism and allowed for the deepening penetration of financial markets and logics into every aspect of daily life. Just look at your life. Look at your debts, at your credit cards, at the way you pay for things, at the way you borrow money. Anyway, that was my comments. And then Mara concludes, paradoxically, in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the state supported a further push toward consolidated financial control. As a result, a new phase of accumulation has stabilized, and finance has shockingly emerged from the crash even stronger than it was going in. So this is again is sort of he's as a student of Leo Panitch, this is his theoretical emphasis on the finance's relation to the corporate state and how that's evolved in the last 40 years and especially in the last 10 years, and how it affects companies like GE, which, as he talks about in Henwood's program, has been transformed by this neoliberal context and is no longer and doesn't compete well with within this context.
An example of what this collusion does mean from our researcher J.B. Nicholson, who points out that amidst all the falderall in Congress about States of the Union messages and things like that, the Democrats are letting H.R. 676 die in silence after never having been brought up for a vote. H.R. House Resolution 676 establishes a single-payer system, like all advanced countries have now, to pay for the medical treatment of Americans. It's primitive and bizarre that the U.S. has no such system, and it has no such system because of the dominance of money in the American medical establishment. The first thing the British Labour Party did at the end of the Second World War, after they tossed out the racist and racist warmonger Winston Churchill in 1946, was to establish a modern health care system, the sort of thing we call single payer, a system of health care that means that you get health services when you need them, not when you have enough money in your wallet to pay for them.
I would only add that it was a National Health Service was run totally by the government as opposed to paying private corporations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Democrats in Congress today are letting, after all these years, a system like the Labour Party in Britain established in 1946, are letting a system like that die on the vine by not supporting this House Resolution 676. They're letting it die in silence after never having been brought up for a vote, not even when Democrats were the majority in Congress and had a Democratic Party president, the Obama administration. Whatever new bill Representative Pramila Jayapal is working on will get a new number. She was responsible for the former H.R. 676. The ironies here are great, and you can't think that it's entirely an accident. The new H.R. 676 doesn't have anything to do with medical care. It's now a bill that, quote, reiterates the support of the Congress of the United States for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, close quote, the U.S. way of controlling the militaries of Europe, and a good deal more. That was passed by the Democrats in Congress without a dissenting vote. This turns, and what this means, of course, is a call, the new H.R. 676, a call for more encroachment on and provocation of Russia. A call for treating Americans better and more healthfully becomes a call tantamount for more war. That is, an anti-neoliberal message, you might say, becomes a neoconservative measure. This is a good account of what happened. For the past 16 years, H.R. 676 was our gold standard bill defining a national improved Medicare for all, single-payer health care system for the United States. It was based on the 2003 Physicians Working Group proposal by Physicians for a National Health Program. This isn't new. This has been around for a long time. Now that the Democrats can no longer ignore that their base is demanding a single-payer health system, that's what all the polls show, we've lost both H.R. 676 by number and its status as a gold standard. From what we've heard, as we've still not seen the text of the draft as promised, the new health bill, being written by Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, a Democrat from Washington, has an unnecessarily long transition period and maintains the for-profit providers in the system. So even the new supposedly improved Medicare system is actually the old system, gussied up a bit. The delayed transition means more preventable deaths and suffering. Keeping the for-profits means higher costs and lower quality of care. And of course, as you can imagine, the bill is being written behind closed doors. It's not a matter of public debate. Last month, single-payer advocates called on Jayapal to share the draft text of H.R. 676 with the single-payer movement for review and input. She has refused. Kay Twillow of Unions for Single Payer says that unless the movement acts quickly to assure H.R. 676 ban on for-profit institutions is maintained, Jayapal's new bill remove this vital section of H.R. 676. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health care is the most shocking and inhumane. It's a compromise that there is no need to make. We're getting hearings in this Congress. Why should we take the impact of the for-profits, that is the health care institutions, out of the discussion before the debate starts? We gain nothing. The ban on for-profits has been in H.R. 676 since the beginning. It did not stop 124 congresspersons from signing on to it. It did not stop unions, organizations, cities, counties, and many others from endorsing it. It was one of the popular provisions that all of those who've dealt with these for-profit hustlers welcomed. Now, the point is that the overwhelmingly popular move towards single-payer health care, Medicare for all, the sort of things that I say civilized countries have, that whole movement is supported substantially across the board, in spite of all the negative publicity, by a majority of Americans. The Democrats know that, and therefore pay some lip service to the idea of improving Medicare for all, improving American health service with Medicare for all, and then put together a bill which doesn't do it. Put together a bill that pays off the usual people and leaves Americans with a situation that even the British have not had since 1946. This is a scandal. And if our mainstream media was really talking about things the government is doing that affected Americans, we'd hear about it. It takes our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, to bring it to our attention.
Yeah, so the question becomes, who are these new Democrats in Congress, and what are they going to be up to, and how are we going to sort out the various views of someone like Jayapal,
I have trouble with her name too.
and the newer ones like AOC or another one that I've made a note here for your pleasure, Carl, because you brought this up a few weeks ago. The defeat of Michael Capuano in Massachusetts by Ayanna Pressley.
Right.
Thomas Edsall wrote about this in his New York Times think piece, sort of social analysis think piece this past week. He and I think I'll be interested to hear your response to this as a former resident. When Capuano first won election to Congress in 1998, he owed his victory in the 10-candidate Democratic primary to his hometown. He carried Somerville with 7,852 votes, more than the total vote for all nine opponents, while losing to other candidates in Boston, Belmont, Cambridge, Chelsea, and Watertown. The impact, and then Edsall goes on to say, the impact of gentrification, meaning in Somerville, is striking. By 2017, 61.2% of Somerville's residents, 25 or older, had at least a bachelor's degree, compared with 30.9% nationwide. The median household income was $84,000 plus, compared with $57,000 plus at a national level. Somerville had moved from downscale to upscale, not to the level of Brattle Street in Cambridge or Boston's Beacon Hill, but still many steps up the ladder, this former working class town. In the process, Somerville left Capuano, a white working class Democrat in the mold of Tip O'Neill, behind. In 2018, you're getting antsy, right?
No.
In 2018,
Just old Tip.
in 2018, 20 years after first winning his House seat, Capuano could no longer count on Somerville, despite his deep roots. His father had been mayor before him. The vote there was a wash. Capuano received about the same as Ayanna Pressley, an African American Boston City Councilwoman, but Pressley swept Cambridge and Boston to crush Capuano 60,000 to 42,000 district-wide. And then he refers to the same pattern by which AOC defeated Joe Crowley. And the question becomes, what does it mean that these people, and it's been brought up in the AOC context also, what does it mean that these women have won seats, or anyone has won these seats in these gentrified contexts? What does it mean about the future of their policies? And when one looks at Presley's website, one sees that her foreign policy, just like Kamala Harris,
there we go,
for Israel-Palestine, is nothing to speak of, just the same sort of boilerplate kind of stuff. And even she makes a pithy comment about North Korea, basically saying, I assume this is partly in response to what Donald Trump's efforts were there. Any potential avenue to peace and stability on the Korean peninsula is a welcome opportunity, especially if it leads to meaningful progress. However, Donald Trump has demonstrated time and again he is erratic and unfit for office. So Congress and the American people should hold him accountable when it comes to his actions toward North Korea. Blah 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 blah. So far, the president's efforts seem to have yielded little in the way of positive progress. Thanks a lot, Ayanna, for your kind words. So anyway,
David, you put your finger upon an example that I'm particularly interested in, and I think shows a really important aspect of contemporary politics among the Democrats. First of all, I do know something about the area. I lived for a long time in that region. Somerville was a working-class suburb of Boston. Internal suburb, so to speak, of Boston. I lived in the next one over, Dorchester, another working-class suburb of Boston. I did theater in Somerville for a long time. It was a regular stop on my route.
And you're still widely known for that in that area, right?
Within a select population, yes. Very select, two or three guys. This is long ago and far away, and the wench is dead, as the poet says. But unfortunately, that's not true of the issues. What's actually happened in that region since those long ago days that I spent time there is rightly represented by this man you talk about, Capuano. He was a long-time representative from this district, an old white man, God help us, and an old-style liberal. And by old-style liberal, I mean a neoliberal, a pre-capitalist seizure of the Democratic Party, liberal. That's why I jumped when you compared him with Tip O'Neill, because I think the combination is good and different. O'Neill is on the route to the sort of neoliberal domination of the Democratic Party we have now, but it's a complicated story. The point was that Capuano, who was representative in the last Congress from this region, as he had been for many years, was given a primary opponent by the Democratic Party. The man has been a Democrat since I was born. God help us. he was given a Democratic opponent, a primary opponent. The primary opponent was a young black woman who was on the Boston City Council. And you would say, well, okay, we've got an old white guy who's...
Sponsored by John Kerry during
exactly.
her career.
That's precisely right. And people didn't notice what the real difference between them was. The real difference was that Capuano predated neoliberalism. Capuano predated the conversion to neoconservatism in the Democratic Party as well. That is, he was an old anti-war Democrat, and the young black woman who was put up by the Democratic Party to oppose him, and eventually did replace him, was neoliberal and neoconservative, pro-war and pro the economic transformation of the Democratic Party. This was a test case, if you like, of what's happening here. It's not quite right to talk about it as a matter of gentrification, although that was involved in it, however complexly. But what we're dealing with here is the way in which the duopoly, or at least in this case the Democratic Party, the Republicans don't really matter so much in the region, was taking care of the old Democratic anti-war and anti-corporate themes that go back to the Vietnam War. And that is the replacement of the new generation. And it's clear who the beneficiaries of this displacement are within the Democratic Party. It's not the populace at large, it's rather the 1%. That's who the new identity politics representative for the 10th District in Massachusetts actually represents. It's a shameful case, but a one that, if were better known, would tell us a good deal more about the contemporary state of American politics among the self-styled liberals, and particularly the Democratic Party. So I'm very glad you brought it up.
Yeah, well, and whereas Edsel wants us to sort of compare this or see Presley's election is somewhat analogous to AOC's. The question remains what the difference is between these two women. So
and which way AOC...
women, yeah. I don't want to generalize about that.
No, but you're absolutely right.
He is.
You're absolutely right. And the question is which route will AOC take? The same one as... I'm having trouble with names today. Presley in Boston, or is the one that we would... the Democratic Party propaganda suggests that she should take. We'll put that Thomas Edsel's article on the Facebook page for News from Neptune and try to talk about this complex and difficult story in some ways. But my old home down in Boston gives us an interesting test case. You're watching News from Neptune. We have a couple of minutes left. Got something you want to go out on?
Yeah, okay. How about this one in this morning's News Gazette?
Oh dear.
UI's his new favorite brand. Headline: UI's, meaning the little red schoolhouse, is his new favorite brand. Uni, meaning Uni High alum, named school's first chief marketing officer. Julie Worth's story. In the corporate marketing world, Champagne's Eric Miner has worked on some familiar brands, from Cheetos and Raid to 9 Lives cat food, even choosing the latest Morris. That's Morris the cat. I didn't know Morris was still going. The University
like
of
us.
I don't watch that kind of TV. The University of Illinois alumnus will now be applying more than 2 decades of experience in corporate brand marketing to the UI as the campus's first chief marketing officer. Miner, now senior director of marketing and innovation for the Arcola-based Libman company, they're the ones who make your brooms and brushes and things, was named to the UI position Thursday. The appointment takes effect January 31st, pending approval from the UI trustees next week. Somehow I think they will. He will earn $230,000 annually. So the anti-intellectualism at this university is a sight to behold, I have to say.
Well, at least it protects us from incivility. Whatever became of Mr. Saleta, huh?
Yeah, right. I mean, I have a feeling that Mr. Minor isn't going to suffer the same
Exactly.
fate as someone who was impertinent enough to say angry things about killing children in Gaza.
We'll conclude today with a note from our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, who writes, "We're now a little over 2 years into Russiagate. The closest they've come to making a valid point," he's referring to the Mueller probe in the attempt to show that, as mad writers for even The Intercept say, Trump is a traitor. The closest they've come to making a valid point is that some Russians bought social media ads for thousands of dollars. How much did Mrs. Clinton spend on her campaign? For thousands of dollars in total, some of which ran and may have had something to say about the 2016 U.S. elections. But this is wildly exaggerated in terms of effect and leaves some showstopper questions unanswered. The amount of money spent is too small to have any effect, and so what? Do we give up on free speech principles because Russians are involved? What of the massive hypocrisy of any American getting upset over foreign meddling in elections? Don't we have something to do with that in Venezuela right now?
Yeah.
You have been watching News from Neptune for the fourth week of 2019, a wrong question edition, as the U.S. political establishment moves to overthrow, by coups, the elected presidents of Venezuela and the U.S., as Presidents Maduro and Trump threaten to inhibit the economic dominance secured by violence of the U.S. 1%. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young with Andrew Scolleray. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you of the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest: "What's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge." In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.